There are rivalries that simmer for decades beneath the surface of diplomatic courtesy, hidden behind the formal embraces of leaders photographed together at summits, buried under the carefully worded joint statements that say everything and mean nothing, concealed within the architecture of alliances that present a unified face to the world while fracturing quietly and dangerously from within. And then there are the moments when those rivalries stop simmering, when the patience runs out, when the calculation shifts from managing the competition to winning it, decisively, permanently, and without the ambiguity that leaves the rival space to recover and regroup. Mohammed bin Salman has reached that moment with Abu Dhabi. What is being described in the most restricted circles of Gulf diplomatic intelligence as MBS's final ultimatum? The activation of a secret plan so precisely calibrated, so ruthlessly designed, and so perfectly timed to exploit Abu Dhabi's specific structural vulnerabilities that analysts who have spent careers studying Gulf power dynamics are struggling to find historical precedent for it, is not the impulsive aggression of a leader acting from emotion. It is the culmination of years of patient strategic preparation. It is the moment when a plan that has been developed, refined, and held in reserve for exactly the right conditions is finally being activated because the conditions have arrived and the window is open. And MBS has decided that 2026 is the year that the question of who truly leads the Gulf gets answered in terms that cannot be revisited. The plan is designed to bankrupt Abu Dhabi, not metaphorically, not in the loose sense in which political commentators use economic language to describe competitive disadvantage, literally, structurally. In the specific, technical, financial sense of driving the Emirates' sovereign wealth position, its investment returns, its currency credibility, and its international financial standing to a point of such acute distress that the political consequences within the UAE's own power structure, consequences for the relationship between Abu Dhabi and Dubai, for the cohesion of the Federation, for Mohammed bin Zayed's ability to maintain the internal consensus that has been the foundation of Abu Dhabi's regional influence, become unmanageable. This is the final ultimatum. Accept Saudi primacy in the Gulf order that MBS is constructing. Accept it formally, structurally, and in ways that are institutionally embedded rather than merely diplomatically acknowledged, or face the systematic financial destruction of the economic foundation on which Abu Dhabi's regional influence and international ambitions rest. To understand why this is happening now, why MBS has chosen 2026 as the year to activate this plan, and why Abu Dhabi's specific vulnerabilities make it susceptible to exactly the kind of pressure MBS has designed, you have to understand the relationship between these two entities in its full complexity, the history of cooperation and competition that has been building toward this confrontation for years. Saudi Arabia and the UAE, specifically Abu Dhabi, which holds the political and financial power within the Federation, have been presenting a unified face to the world throughout the period of Gulf realignment that MBS's rise to power initiated. They stood together in the Qatar blockade of 2017. They have coordinated on OPEC production decisions. They have shared intelligence and security cooperation against Iranian threats. They have invested together in regional stability projects and in the international diplomatic initiatives that have reshaped the Middle East's political architecture over the past decade. But beneath that cooperation has run a current of competition that has been intensifying with every year of MBS's consolidation of Saudi power and every year of Abu Dhabi's expansion of its own international profile and financial ambitions. The competition is about something fundamental, about which entity will serve as the primary node of Gulf power in the emerging multipolar world, about which capital, Riyadh or Abu Dhabi, will be the center of gravity for the region's financial flows, its diplomatic relationships, its technological development, and its cultural projection. About which leader, MBS or Mohammed bin Zayed, will be recognized within the Gulf and by the great powers that engage with it as the defining voice of the Arab Gulf in the conversations that will shape the 21st century. For most of the period since MBS consolidated his position, the competition has been managed with the surface courtesy that Gulf diplomatic culture demands and that both sides have understood serves their mutual interest in presenting regional unity to outside powers. But management is not resolution, and the specific developments of the past 2 years have pushed the competition beyond the threshold where management remains sustainable. The trigger, the specific development that converted ongoing competition into the final ultimatum, is Abu Dhabi's systematic and increasingly aggressive effort to position itself as an alternative to Saudi Arabia in domains that MBS has identified as core to his Vision 2030 strategy and his regional primacy project. Abu Dhabi's financial offensive has been the most visible and most directly threatening element of this positioning. The Abu Dhabi Investment Authority and Mubadala, two of the world's largest and most sophisticated sovereign wealth funds, have been deploying capital in the specific sectors and in the specific geographies that Saudi Arabia's Public Investment Fund has identified as its strategic priorities. Technology investment, artificial intelligence infrastructure, renewable energy, entertainment and tourism, advanced manufacturing. In each of these domains, Abu Dhabi has been moving with speed and with financial firepower that directly competes with Saudi investment strategies in ways that reduce returns, complicate partnerships, and challenge Saudi Arabia's ability to attract the specific caliber of international partners that Vision 2030 requires. The competition for global financial talent has been particularly acute. Abu Dhabi has been systematically recruiting the fund managers, the technology executives, the financial engineers, and the strategic advisors that Saudi Arabia has been trying to attract to Riyadh as part of its effort to establish the city as the region's premier financial center. Every international finance professional who chooses Abu Dhabi's ADGM Financial Center over Riyadh's emerging financial district is a small tactical victory in a competition that has accumulated into strategic significance. The diplomatic competition has run parallel to the financial one. Abu Dhabi has been cultivating its own network of international relationships with India, with China, with Israel, with European capitals, with the United States, in ways that position it as an independent and indispensable interlocutor rather than as a component of a Saudi-led Gulf bloc. The Abraham Accords, in which the UAE normalized relations with Israel before Saudi Arabia, was a moment of particular competitive significance. Abu Dhabi positioned itself as the pioneer of a new regional order rather than waiting for Riyadh to lead, acquiring the international recognition and the specific relationship with Israel that has generated its own dividends in technology access, intelligence sharing, and diplomatic capital. MBS watched all of this with the patience of a leader who understood that the time to respond was not when his position was weakest, but when his position was strongest, and Abu Dhabi's vulnerabilities were most exposed. 2026 is that moment. And the specific vulnerabilities that MBS's plan is designed to exploit are precisely the structural weaknesses that Abu Dhabi's aggressive expansion has created. Let's examine those vulnerabilities with the precision they require, because the specific financial and structural weaknesses that MBS has identified and is targeting are the mechanism through which the plan operates, and understanding them is essential to grasping why Abu Dhabi, for all its financial sophistication and all its sovereign wealth, is genuinely susceptible to the pressure MBS is now applying. The first and most fundamental vulnerability is oil price dependence. Abu Dhabi's sovereign wealth and its budget stability rest on oil revenues in ways that are more acute than the Emirates' diversification narrative acknowledges. ADNOC, the Abu Dhabi National Oil Company, generates the revenue flows that sustain ADIA, Mubadala, and the government expenditure that supports Abu Dhabi's social contract with its population and its political elite. Diversification is real and significant, but it is not yet sufficient to insulate Abu Dhabi's financial position from acute oil price pressure. Saudi Arabia, as the world's largest oil exporter and the dominant voice in OPEC Plus production decisions, has the ability to influence oil prices in ways that Abu Dhabi cannot resist or offset. MBS's plan involves the coordinated use of Saudi production decisions, increases in production that drive prices lower, sustained at levels and for periods that are painful for Abu Dhabi's revenue position, but manageable for Saudi Arabia's larger and more diversified revenue base, to create fiscal pressure on Abu Dhabi that compounds over time into genuine structural distress. This is not a new instrument in the Gulf Power Toolkit. Saudi Arabia has used oil price as a geopolitical instrument before, against Russia, against American shale producers, against other OPEC members whose political behavior Riyadh wanted to influence. What is new is the application of this instrument with the specific precision and the specific intent of targeting Abu Dhabi's financial position as a component of an internal Gulf power struggle. The second vulnerability is investment overextension. Abu Dhabi's sovereign wealth funds have been deploying capital at a pace and in a diversity of geographies and sectors that has created a portfolio whose management complexity is at the frontier of what even the most sophisticated financial institution can handle effectively. The pursuit of competitive positioning against Saudi Arabia, the imperative to be present in every market and every sector where Riyadh is building relationships, has driven investment decisions that are not always grounded in the cold return calculations that should govern sovereign wealth deployment. MBS's financial intelligence apparatus has mapped Abu Dhabi's investment portfolio with considerable precision, identifying the specific positions that are most vulnerable to coordinated pressure, the partnerships that can be disrupted through Saudi counteroffers or Saudi competitive entry, and the financing structures that depend on market conditions that Saudi Arabia can influence. The financial engineering dimension of MBS's plan involves the activation of these identified vulnerabilities in sequences designed to create cascading pressure, each disruption creating conditions that make adjacent positions more difficult to sustain, the cumulative effect compounding into a financial distress signal that the international investment community cannot ignore. The third vulnerability is the UAE's internal political complexity. the relationship between Abu Dhabi and Dubai that has always been the structural fault line within the federation. Dubai's economy, its financial model, its international positioning, all are different from Abu Dhabi's in ways that create divergent interests and divergent responses to external pressure. Dubai is more exposed to international financial flows, more dependent on trade and tourism and financial services, and more sensitive to reputational damage from perceptions of instability within the UAE's governance structure. MBS's plan includes dimensions designed to stress the Abu Dhabi-Dubai relationship by creating conditions in which Dubai's interests and Abu Dhabi's interests diverge more sharply than the federal structure can comfortably accommodate. Pressure on Abu Dhabi's oil revenues that does not equally affect Dubai creates a fiscal imbalance within the federation that generates internal political friction. Investment disruptions that affect Abu Dhabi's sovereign wealth position without equally affecting Dubai's trade and financial services model create competing priorities for federal resource allocation. The deliberate exploitation of the Abu Dhabi-Dubai fault line is the most politically sophisticated element of MBS's plan, and the one whose consequences are most difficult for Abu Dhabi to manage, because managing the internal politics of the UAE Federation is ultimately Mohammed bin Zayed's problem rather than MBS's. The fourth vulnerability is international partner dependence. Abu Dhabi's strategic ambitions, its positioning as an independent pole of Gulf power with its own international relationships and its own diplomatic profile, depend on the maintenance of relationships with major powers that have their own interests and their own calculations about where to place their primary Gulf bets. The United States, China, India, the United Kingdom, all have relationships with both Saudi Arabia and Abu Dhabi, and all are constantly recalibrating those relationships based on their assessment of which Gulf partner is more valuable, more reliable, and more central to their regional interests. MBS has been working systematically to shift that recalibration in Saudi Arabia's favor, not just through the direct cultivation of Saudi relationships with major powers, but through the specific strategy of demonstrating that Saudi Arabia can deliver outcomes in the Gulf and the broader region that Abu Dhabi cannot. The recent episodes documented in this series, the Pakistani nuclear deterrence framework, the deployment of Pakistani troops, the coordination with China on Hormuz, the financial leverage over Pakistan, are all components of this demonstration strategy. Each one reinforces the message to major power capitals that Riyadh, not Abu Dhabi, is the indispensable Gulf interlocutor. As that message takes hold, as the major powers' daily experience of Gulf engagement reinforces the conclusion that Saudi Arabia is the primary address for the region's most consequential decisions, Abu Dhabi's independent diplomatic positioning becomes harder to sustain. The relationships it has cultivated begin to feel, from the partner's perspective, like they're relationships with a secondary actor rather than a primary one. Investment in those relationships, political capital, senior attention, the specific engagement that signals genuine priority, begins to flow more toward Riyadh and less toward Abu Dhabi, creating a self-reinforcing dynamic that compounds the financial and structural pressures MBS is applying through other channels. Now, let's examine the specific timeline of 2026. Why this year, why now, and what the conditions are that make this the moment MBS has chosen to activate the plan rather than continuing to manage the competition through the surface, courtesy that has characterized it until now. Several convergences make 2026 the year of the final ultimatum. The first is Saudi Arabia's own strengthened position. Vision 2030 has reached a stage of implementation where the kingdom's financial and institutional capacity to sustain a period of deliberately reduced oil prices, to absorb the revenue cost of the production increases that are the primary financial weapon in MBS's plan, is significantly stronger than it was in earlier years. The diversification of Saudi revenues, the development of non-oil income streams through tourism, entertainment, and manufacturing, and the accumulation of financial reserves managed through the Public Investment Fund gives Saudi Arabia a buffer against low oil prices that allows it to sustain production levels that are painful for Abu Dhabi for longer periods than Abu Dhabi can comfortably endure. The second convergence is the specific vulnerability of Abu Dhabi's investment portfolio in 2026. The global investment environment, the specific conditions in technology markets and real estate, and the financial sectors where Abu Dhabi has concentrated significant sovereign wealth exposure, creates a context in which coordinated pressure on Abu Dhabi's positions can produce outsized distress relative to the pressure applied. The overextension of the previous years of aggressive deployment is at its most exposed precisely when market conditions are most challenging for the sectors Abu Dhabi has prioritized. The third convergence is Mohammed bin Zayed's own political position within Abu Dhabi and within the UAE. The internal dynamics of Abu Dhabi's ruling family, never simple, always subject to the specific tensions that concentrated power and concentrated wealth create within dynastic structures, have reached a point where MBS's intelligence assessment identifies vulnerabilities that did not exist in earlier periods. The specific individuals within Abu Dhabi's power structure whose interests diverge from MBZ's, whose receptiveness to a recalibration of the Abu Dhabi-Saudi relationship might, under sufficient pressure, translate into internal political friction that complicates MBZ's ability to mount a coherent response, are identified and are being engaged through the specific channels of Gulf relationship politics that MBS has developed into a refined instrument of influence. The fourth convergence is the international context. The specific configuration of major power interests and attentions in 2026 that creates the most favorable environment for MBS to execute his plan without generating the kind of external intervention that might complicate or derail it. American attention is focused on multiple simultaneous crises. Chinese attention is consumed by its own economic challenges and its own strategic priorities. The international financial institutions that might otherwise provide Abu Dhabi with buffers against the pressure MBS is applying are operating in an environment of constrained capacity and competing demands that limits their ability to serve as effective backstops. The plan's execution is already underway. The earliest phases, the production increases that are beginning to create the oil price pressure that will compound through Abu Dhabi's revenue position over the coming months. The investment positioning that is starting to stress specific Abu Dhabi sovereign wealth exposures, the diplomatic signaling that is reinforcing major power recalibration toward Riyadh, are active. The initial effects are not yet visible in the public financial data in ways that generate mainstream attention. But within Abu Dhabi's financial institutions and within the inner circle of its political leadership, the signals are being read with the urgency of men who understand what is being done to them and who are scrambling to assess whether their available responses are adequate to the threat. Abu Dhabi's options for responding to MBS's plan are real, but constrained in ways that reflect the specific power asymmetry that the plan is designed to exploit. The most obvious response, direct escalation, a counter-campaign that uses Abu Dhabi's own financial resources to create pressure on Saudi Arabia, faces the fundamental problem that Saudi Arabia's financial position is stronger, its revenue base is larger, and its ability to sustain a financial competition over the required time frame exceeds Abu Dhabi's equivalent capacity. A financial war of attrition between Riyadh and Abu Dhabi is a war that Abu Dhabi cannot win because its resources, while enormous in absolute terms, are smaller than Saudi Arabia's and are more exposed to exactly the mechanisms of pressure that MBS has chosen. The diplomatic response, seeking the protection of major power relationships that Abu Dhabi has cultivated to insulate itself from Saudi pressure, faces the problem that those relationships are themselves being recalibrated in Riyadh's favor through exactly the demonstration strategy that MBS has been executing. An Abu Dhabi that runs to Washington or Beijing seeking protection from Saudi pressure is an Abu Dhabi that confirms, in the most visible possible way, that it is a secondary actor seeking external protection rather than a primary actor with independent strategic capacity. The act of seeking protection undermines the positioning that the protection is supposed to preserve. The internal UAE response, mobilizing Dubai's interests and the interests of the other Emirates as a counterweight to Saudi pressure on Abu Dhabi, creates exactly the internal political friction that MBS's plan is designed to generate. Every conversation within the UAE's federal structure about how to respond to Saudi pressure is a conversation that highlights the divergence of interests between Abu Dhabi and Dubai, and that gives the fault line in the federation more visibility and more political significance than Abu Dhabi's leadership wants. The most potentially effective response, genuine accommodation of Saudi primacy demands, a negotiated acknowledgement of the hierarchy that MBS is seeking to establish, is the response that the ultimatum is designed to produce. And it is the response that Abu Dhabi's political culture and Mohammed bin Zayed's own sense of his position make most psychologically difficult to deliver. A leader who has built his identity and his legacy on Abu Dhabi's independent strategic profile, who has cultivated relationships with India and Israel and China and the United States as expressions of Abu Dhabi's independent standing, does not easily concede the primacy that those relationships were designed to establish. This is the trap that MBS has constructed with the strategic precision that has characterized his most consequential moves. Every available response is worse than the one before it. Escalation cannot be sustained. External protection undermines the positioning it protects. Internal mobilization creates the friction it attempts to counter. And accommodation requires the psychological concession that represents the plan's ultimate objective. The world is watching what happens in the Gulf in 2026 with more attention than it typically pays to intra-Arab competition. Because what MBS is doing to Abu Dhabi is not simply a bilateral power struggle between two wealthy Gulf entities whose rivalry has limited implications for the rest of the world. It is a demonstration, the most consequential and most precisely executed demonstration yet, of how MBS uses the full spectrum of available instruments to reshape the strategic environment around him in ways that serve Saudi primacy. The financial weapons, the diplomatic positioning, the exploitation of structural vulnerabilities, the targeting of internal political fault lines, the timing that chooses the moment of maximum adversary vulnerability and maximum Saudi strength. All of it is visible in what is being done to Abu Dhabi, and all of it speaks to the nature of the Gulf order that MBS is constructing, an order in which Saudi Arabia is not simply the largest Gulf state, but the unambiguous center of gravity around which every other Gulf actor organizes its strategic choices. Abu Dhabi's response to the final ultimatum will determine whether that order is established through accommodation or through the specific financial and political distress that MBS's plan is designed to produce if accommodation is withheld. The timeline is 2026. The pressure is building. And Mohammed bin Zayed is confronting a choice that his counterpart in Riyadh has engineered with the patient, ruthless precision of a leader who has been preparing for exactly this moment for years. The ultimatum is final in the most literal sense. It is not the opening of a negotiation. It is the closing of a window. Accept the new order on MBS's terms, or watch the financial foundation of Abu Dhabi's regional ambitions be systematically dismantled by the one actor in the Gulf with both the motive and the means to do it. The plan is in motion. The clock is running. And the Gulf that emerges from 2026 will be defined by what Abu Dhabi decides and what that decision costs. In the months that are already beginning,